I was part of the last echelon of debarkation from Iwakuni. I was there to turn out the lights. So we arrived, our squadron kind of trickled in as far as personnel and equipment were concerned. But I was the last of the personnel. So to answer your question, as I recall, it was maybe mid-June of 1972. I don't remember the precise date. I had reported to Iwakuni in April. And to be perfectly honest about it, I thought that, well, this is good. I'm going to be skiing in Sapporo and shopping at the Ginza. You know, I'm already planning my Westpac tour / vacation. Of course, the Marine Corps, eager to barge through any door that's left slightly ajar, we had heard rumors we might be going south. I was there, officially, it was temporary duty because my permanent duty station was still Iwakuni. But we were an expeditionary force, and I will say this, the Marine Corps' credit, they honored the date for Westpac rotation, which is a year tour. So I was at Nampong for 9 months, and I left there, this date I won't forget, March 27th, 1973. So my experience was, with maybe a couple of exceptions over Laos, never flew into Cambodia. With me, it was North and South Vietnam, either side of the DMZ, depending upon whether we were doing close air support during the day or armed road reconnaissance at night. Unlike the F-4s, they were diurnal, we were nocturnal as well. So we had 24-hour operations. We began day only. As a matter of fact, my first mission, it was kind of interesting. We flew on the wing of, I think it was an Air Force F-4, because they were equipped with Loran, which is not very precise, but it's kind of a long distance navigation. And because we were kind of thrown into the mix almost immediately, we had no familiarity with targets, topography. It was basically kind of a high altitude drop off their wing. We flew mostly South Vietnam during the day, and we were that exclusively, but we started night missions, trying to think, maybe it was mid-July.
Okay.
And then we really ramped up air ops that summer. What the F-4 pilot Mike was describing, I don't know if they use the same term, but we called it the Da Nang turn, because it was 2 missions a day, and we were under the auspices of whoever the FAC was. So when we were flying out of Nampong, whatever the ordnance load was, me being the ordnance officer, I was responsible for making sure that all the aircraft were loaded per the operations order. So it was usually a 2-plane formation, a lead and a wingman, and we called it crossing the fence. When we were heading east out of Nampong, it was almost a straight line to just south of the DMZ. The Mekong River is the border between Vietnam and Laos, and we called that the fence because we figured anything east of that, it's immediately hostile, The day missions were close air support for the South Vietnamese. American ground troops had already been withdrawn, but we were part of the air and naval force that was still in country. Curiously enough, we came under the aegis of the 7th Air Force. They were conducting the air ops in Southeast Asia. And we would rearm, refuel at Da Nang. They had sandbag revetments there, and we would go through an intelligence debrief after that first hop. I still remember there was an Air Force staff sergeant there by the name of Spezzano, who, frankly, I wanted to slam up against the wall, and actually I almost ended up doing it, because his standard inquiry to us is, "Where did you puke your bombs today, sir?" You little sniveling brat, you know, we're hanging our ass out and you're here in an air-conditioned revetment. That room also had the different sizes of communist rockets. They were stacked up against the wall by height. And yeah, I told Spezzano, I said, you'd fit nicely between a couple of those rockets, so shut up. When we took off, we would basically go into an area, and then we would hook up by radio with whatever the FAC wanted. Frankly, although I'm familiar with the name Anlock, I don't recall it really being part of our missions. As a matter of fact, just as a little sidebar to Quang Tri and Hue, both were basically French colonial cities, and they still had some worthwhile architecture. Now, we didn't fly there every day over the summer, and the consequence was we would fly there maybe every 3 or 4 days, and so it was like watching time-lapse photography. I could see just Quang Tri eroding, the center of which was this citadel, and it's like each time I went over there was less and less of it. Hue was the larger city, but it had basically the same pattern. But to my recollection, there was a lot more enemy activity around Quang Tri than Hue, at least when we were flying missions. The other image that's indelible to me, if we put on blinders and we were flying up the South China Sea coast, frankly, the beaches were gorgeous. And I tell the pilot, I said, I said, after the war, this would be probably a pretty nice resort. Except then when we looked inland, it was a lunar landscape. And it was like right out of a war movie. You'd see strings of refugees, the peasants pulling carts and their water buffalo. And so you'd look one way and you'd look the other, and the contrast was rather dramatic and shocking. The night missions, the armed road reconnaissance, had a different profile. That was a single plane mission, almost exclusively southern North Vietnam, because we knew to keep the supply routes open, they had truck convoys that would come down the north. And we had heard rumors that the anti-aircraft, of which they had everything in the Soviet arsenal, they'd shoot everything at us, except SAMs, because at night, the SAM really wouldn't be effective. I mean, if we were flying out high altitude and we were a big target like a B-52, that might be, one thing. But we had electronic countermeasures on board the aircraft that, at least at the time, Bronze Age, it was pretty good at detecting when we were being painted by hostile radar. And we knew what the bandwidth was for SAM radar. And occasionally, we might get a signal. But at least on all my missions, and there were 108 of them, I didn't ever see or have documented that a SAM was fired at us. But another kind of missile could be rather dangerous that it was kind of codenamed Estrella. Yeah, it was the SA-7. It was basically a Chi-Com copy of the Army's Red Eye. You know, it was kind of like a shoulder bazooka-fired heat-seeking missile. And when we would pull off target, and we'd usually, I'm sorry, this is kind of going back to the day missions for a moment. Our tailpipes could be a rather rich heat signature. So we would drop flares, and our term for it was jinking. You never pulled off target, nice, smooth, okay, no. You'd always jink. That was just de rigueur. And we'd usually make 3 runs because we were carrying 18 500-pounders was our usual load. We had 2 inboard drop tanks that were 300 gallons, and that was to give us kind of the extended range. So even though the A6 could carry 28 500-pounders, if it were fully loaded, 18 was our usual load. And just as a sidebar, that 28 is a quarter of a B-52's load. The day missions, I won't say they were pro forma, but there was a certain kind of regular choreography to them, to which we became accustomed. We'd usually make the 3 runs, always from different directions, always jinking when we pulled off target. And this would be whether we were coming from Nam Pong or it was after the Da Nang turn. The night missions, because they were single plane, we would, I'm kind of a fan of Bullwinkle and the Flying Squirrel, Rocky. And the villains in the cartoons were
Boris and Natasha.
Right, Boris and Natasha, and they would report to Mr. Big. Well,
Flying Squirrel.
Big Control was the agent with whom we would check in for the night missions. We were basically off leash because our job was basically to go trolling. And the BN's job in particular, because we're low and fast and we're in very unforgiving topography, would be to, make sure we didn't prang a mountain. Very unforgiving. So the BN would feed the pilot bananas, oh, okay, chimp, this is where I need you to go. No, it's actually, just again, it's another sidebar, and I'm sorry for all these digressions, but the A6, to its credit, had some tactical firsts in it. It was the first aircraft that was really designed for all-weather operations. Secondly, it was the first one that was really designed with a crew concept in mind. Because previous aircraft, like in the F-4, they would have tandem seating. We sat side by side so that we could cross-check one another. And I can tell you that that came in very handy more than once. The third thing is, the A6 look kind of an ugly duckling. Our critics would say, how can you fly that thing? You have the bulbous nose up front and the pointy end pointing to the rear. You need to turn it around. I said, no, we don't. That's to accommodate the 2 radar systems we had, a search radar, which was really pretty reliable and pretty good. I reached a point where when we were trolling for movers, as we called them, I could tune it where I could pick out the trailer hitch on a truck. The track radar was, of course, supposed to augment our accuracy. But I can tell you that the track radar was more temperamental than an opera diva. I mean, the goddamn thing never worked. In fact, in all the time I flew A6s, the only time I saw a full system is when we were on deployment a couple of times in Yuma, and that desert environment, dry, warm weather was more conducive to black boxes operating properly. But in the reality of an expeditionary base, this is where we earned our money, because this was the human backup to systems that were more than fallible. And modesty aside, we got pretty damn good at manual drops. But when you're flying at night, and the weenie F4 guys not only couldn't but wouldn't do this anyway, well, we're going after movers initially on the night missions. I guess the bad guys were really pretty confident. They would run their truck convoys with their lights on and kind of a long string. So I said, God damn, this is like a textbook out of training. This is, yeah, well, they wised up pretty quickly. They turned off their lights and they broke up the convoys into smaller little packets, and we heard a rumor they were even chaining their drivers to the steering wheel. Because we're flying low and fast, they wouldn't hear us coming. They'd only hear us leaving. And it usually meant that they'd be screaming after our departure. So our two biggest obstacles were the terrain, which was impersonable and implacable, and basically our skill as an aircrew. One night mission that kind of sticks out in my mind, I know I'm kind of running on, but in a way this is almost fun. We had been told about what we had dubbed the party boat, which was a freighter that was kind of festooned with lights. It could have been like offshore gambling, or in another environment. And it knew that it was off limits. So it could have all these lights on. And we had our one hand tied behind our backs because we weren't allowed to hit that, which would be obviously the tactical smart thing to do, hit the supply at the source. No. We had to wait until, the term we used is called lighters, but they were basically small barges that would offload from the party boat. And once they reached the shore of North Vietnam, then we could attack. So one night, and I know he's here, actually, this is his first reunion. Gail Seymour was my pilot. And we're kind of nudging one another. I said, okay, we're going to go fishing tonight. But I said, look, I know we're not supposed to do it, and it would probably get us taken home in handcuffs, but at least we'd be home. Let's put an egg right down that smokestack. And he said, well, yeah, I suppose so. I said, oh, this is more than suppose. I mean, what have we been doing? We're only postponing the inevitable. And I said, look, this might wrap up things microscopically a little sooner. So I have my head in the boot. In case you didn't know, BNs have an extendable boot. And the pilot has a duplicate of my search radar, but it's smaller and it doesn't have the resolution. So when I'm in the boot, I've got really a pretty good picture of what's going on. And when you're flying at night, I assure you, you believe your instruments. You don't believe the seat of your pants. Flying over North Vietnam at night, you don't know what a blackout is. I mean, it would probably be easy to get vertigo. You can't see a thing, nothing. Our cockpits, we would bathe in red light so that we still would retain our night vision. But beyond the cockpit, you might as well be flying in a sock drawer. We started a run-in, but I'm in the boot, and I see his course veering off. I said, Gale, come left 4 degrees, come left 7. I said, what the hell are you doing? So I take my head out of the boot, and he's pulling off. And I'll never forget his words, and I've already accosted him with it at this reunion. I said, Gale, do you remember what you said that night? And he says, well, not really. I said, well, I'm more than happy to remind you because it's indelibly etched in my brain and I love it. You said, we're going to create an international incident. I said, Gale, you doofus, what do you think this whole misadventure is?
Good observation.
Unbelievable. But no, we never did. And other crews out at night, they would see it as well. And we had an ops that we call Rooster Brewster, and he was more of your poster grizzled Marine type guy. He was a BN also, so I never actually flew with him. But he told me his little trick is he would hide around the point where the party boat was moored. So he'd remain out of sight, they'd do like a little holding pattern, and then he'd kind of strike like a viper, Okay. The crew concept that our squadron used, they'd still want to kind of cross-pollinate. They would like all the air crews to fly with most everybody else, but usually you had a regular pilot. And mine was Jerry Owen, and I'm a little disappointed that I implored him to come to this reunion, but I never got a response. And he was also one of the co-editors on our squadron cruise book. And he and I had to deliver a wounded A6 to NARF. As you may know, the military is really big on acronyms, and they usually take on a life of their own, sing pack, doop, cack, boop, boop, boop. So sometimes the original agency, whatever it was, is kind of lost in a murky history. Well, NARF means Naval Air Rework Facility. We didn't have any of that in Thailand, but the Navy has a big base. There was a Naval Air Station at QB Point in the Philippines. So we had to ferry that aircraft across the South China Sea. Now, we were told by maintenance control that the radios were really kind of sketchy. In fact, about the only thing airworthy about the aircraft is that the engine works. It seems like most of the subsystems were, kind of like the Hilton elevator. So we're crossing South China Sea, but we can barely get any kind of communication, so we can't get any weather updates. And by the time we arrive in the Philippines, it is a biblical downpour. When he was talking about, how the rain went over like rivers. In the A6, you have a split windscreen, for the pilot and the bomb and air navigator, so it looks like two googly eyes, And even though the angle is beveled, when the rain is coming in horizontally, forget visibility. We could barely make out some lights. On top of this, QB Point was undergoing some kind of power failure, so the runway lights were really dim. And Jerry's first lineup on the lights actually wasn't the runway. It was a line of ships. He was looking at the wrong lights. So we're starting to approach running on fumes now, so we have to go around and do it again. And QB wanted us to divert to Clark Air Force Base. And we said, we don't have the fuel for that. I said, we land here one way or the other. Well, one of the other system failures was the defogging. if you've ever driven a car, you know what happens if the inside of the windshield fogs up. You have to put on the defroster, that kind of thing. Well, ours wasn't working. So to make the visibility even worse, as if we needed more trials by fire, they were fogging up. Well, let's face it, tactical aircraft aren't built to have a high comfort level. So we're ensconced in this rather uncomfortable cubicle, and neither of us could reach the windshield. We'd usually carry kind of rags in our nav bags anyway, just maybe to wipe our brow or wipe our ass, wherever we needed it. So I unfastened my seatbelt and harness. In retrospect, probably not the smartest thing to do. But at least then I could kind of get out of my seat and, I feel like one of those street corner windshield washers in some city. Hey, for a buck, let me clean. Well, here I am. I'm wiping off the fog that had built up on the inside. And anyway, we literally make our last pass before running out of fuel, because I thought we were going to end up in Subic Bay. But we landed okay, and we were going to stick around there for a few days anyway, because we were tasked to go to SERE school. I don't know if you've heard that term, SERE. It means survival, evasion, resistance to interrogation, and escape. All the air crews had it stateside, that kind of training, but we were going to go through it again in the Philippines since we were down for a few days anyway. Well, it turns out in our post-mortem after landing, yes, we ended up ferrying it back, and they did do a good job of fixing it. But Jerry confessed to me, he says, I was going to have us eject, but I couldn't do it because you were unstrapped. I said, well, I'm glad you didn't tell me that at the time, Jerry.
It's been a great privilege, sir. And I know that I speak for Malcolm and our entire team when we say thank you, sir, and thank you for your service.